Uh, Good afternoon. For those who are not from Pittsburgh, welcome to our town. My name's Jeff Finkelstein. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. I'll say another word or two about me in a moment. I want to make sure everybody knows who's in the room and people who are live streaming. This is panel 5.2, the Boston Mapping Project. So I'm going to introduce our panel just with their names and titles. The full bios are in your books. As you know, we're not going to be doing that here. So that's your homework. You needed to do that in advance or afterwards. I am a member of the steering committee for the summit and asked to be involved with this panel specifically because while I've been in Pittsburgh for 24 years, I was raised in Boston and part of that Jewish community and have been interested in what's been going on. I actually look forward to learning with all of you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel, and I'm just going to do it in alphabetical order. Alana Breutman is the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at the Jewish Federations of North America, which is based in New York. Jeremy Burton on the end is the CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston. And Peggy Schucker is the Deputy Regional Director of the ADL for the New England region. So I'm going to start with the first and basic question. What's the Boston Mapping Project? And I'll leave it to whoever's going to answer.
I'll kick that off and then turn it over to Peggy. Thank you for having us here. So very simply, on a late Friday afternoon in early June, just as our community was heading into making the Jewish Sabbath, and many of our leaders were going offline, and it happened to be the Jewish holiday weekend of Shavuot. Won't get into the esoterics, but for many of us, we were heading offline for 3 full days. Late on Friday afternoon, somewhere around 5:30 p.m., a new website gets launched, and it drops into the community. It's called the Boston Mapping Project. And essentially, and we have up on the screen so you can see a little bit of what it looks like, they had a manifesto on their homepage in which they laid out that essentially the Jewish community in Greater Boston was to be held accountable for all of the sins of our society, starting with Zionism, the ongoing relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, but extending to everything from the disenfranchisement of local communities in Boston to tax breaks that go to local universities that impact the development of housing in our city. You almost could read this thing and be taken from it that it was the Jews' fault that the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock in the way they framed it. And they said in their mission statement on their homepage that their goal in pursuing this mapping was to reveal the local entities and networks that enact devastation, I'm quoting, so that we can dismantle them. And it concludes, every entity has an address, every network can be disrupted. Now, to understand what it actually is as a map, essentially what they did was they took some 40 plus Jewish organizations in Greater Boston, plus several other adjacent institutions like family foundations, and put a pin on a map of Massachusetts, a pin where they are physically located, their offices, many of them not even really like particularly public institutions, although this was public information from, say, their IRS 990s, and then drew a digital thread from them, a thread as you would if you were drawing a map on the wall of your bedroom, from them to other institutions that they supposedly influence. So, for example, our ICA, our Modern Art Museum, and then showing a thread from, here are Jewish donors who fund the ICA. Here are the influence of, say, an organization on various local institutions and actors and civic leaders. Here are our local institutions in partnerships with a certain university. And they mapped that network of influence across Massachusetts. And if you click down on each one of these, as you can see on the thing in front of you where it was the ADL, you might click down and you would see specifically that institution's web of influence. And then you could click through to a profile. And every profile talked about that institution's nefarious doings, each leading off with the particulars around the state of Israel, but covering a wide range of other nefarious things and listing the names of board members, staff members, various links to various articles and stuff, basically an indictment, one by one, of these institutions that were to be disrupted and dismantled, in their own words. I'm going to turn it over to Peggy to say more, but to suffice to say that by the end of that holiday weekend, our Jewish Community Relations Council, the ADL, several other of our institutions were hearing from all these institutions. People were frankly freaked out. While some of us, like us, are accustomed to, from time to time, protesters showing up in front of our buildings, many of these folks are not. Many of them are small family foundations who may be do not expect to have their information published somewhere. Some of them were institutions like a disability services organization or a day school that are not accustomed to be having a target put on their back for whatever accusations, accurate or not, connected to the community or not. Some of them called law enforcement before we had even been reached out to by them. They called their local police departments because they immediately perceived this as a direct threat. One of them, a day school, was having its commencement that week and was increasing security beyond its already prudent security that any Jewish institution has. Many, many of them felt anxiety and experienced something that was more than the "I'm Jewish, therefore I am a target." It was very much here is a roadmap to being a target for them. And it created a really heightened sense of vulnerability in our community and a lot of discourse in those first days about why we were being targeted, who's doing the targeting, and how to address it as a community. And with that, I'll turn it over to Peggy to say a little more about the map.
Sure. So, this roadmap that Jeremy's talking about was a literal roadmap. For many of the philanthropic donors to the Jewish community, they're often small family foundations, and the address on their public filings is their home address. So that was pretty disconcerting for many. We had board members, Jeremy's organization at ADL and at CJP. Their names were suddenly out there in a very public way. Now, you could always say, well, a lot of that information was publicly available, but it was all the words around it and what the messaging was about it that first made people feel vulnerable and then made people feel really, really angry. And we'll go into that in a little bit. But the point I want to make right now is that sort of the underlying messages here when you look into the mapping project and click on any of the links there. And while I hate to give this website more traffic, you kind of have to experience it to understand the depth of the interactivity and the rhetoric surrounding it. It's mapliberation.org, but just don't go there a lot. It has, the messaging here was, you don't want to be connected with the Jewish community. They're responsible for all this violence, all of this bad stuff. A theme of isolating the Jewish community, a theme of the power of the Jewish community controlling Boston, the theme of a conspiracy of Jews that are controlling not just, Jewish schools, but you will see vectors like you can see from the one on your left on this slide, which is, ADL's at the epicenter, but look at all the places, we're touching companies, universities, etc. So this idea, this anti-Semitic trope really of Jewish power, conspiracy, scapegoating, and in addition that you're relating or having a relationship with the Jewish community is somehow toxic and you should avoid it at all costs. Those were the themes that were there, not so much the idea that there was public data. And just to put one other point on the table, as we continue our conversation, this isn't something that has happened in isolation. We are starting to put this together with a number of other incidents or activities where the Jewish community is sort of tainted, isolated. UVM, for example, the sexual assault center on campus, no Zionists were going to be served. Sunrise Movement, I think we all remember that. Zionists not welcome until they kind of reconsidered. Even in our local mayor's campaign, one of the very prominent contributor to the mayor's campaign was sort of called out as being a Jewish Zionist contributor and in a manner that was sort of casting aspersions on Michelle Wu, who ultimately became mayor, on her campaign and trying to create an issue there. So those themes of isolation, of claiming that Jews are toxic, of not having a relationship, and employing those old conspiracy theories, those are all embedded in the mapping project. It's not just a political statement.
Thank you. So my colleagues here have done amazing work at identifying and addressing this at the local level. And it's not a local issue alone, because it has been the most egregious recent example of what we've seen as national trends. To give ADL their due, you've been tracking anti-Semitism for years, and the kind of rise that has been seen is really remarkable and very disturbing. The BDS mapping project was but the most egregious and obvious example of this trend. Last December, the American Muslims for Palestine issued a memo that, quote, is intended to provide the American Muslim community with a set of criteria by which to determine whether or not to work with various Jewish organizations, to determine whether or not these organizations have Zionist history. Examples included ADL, American Jewish Committee, Jewish Federations, Jewish Community Relations Councils, and Hillels. Shortly, unless you think that such a ridiculous report has no influence, shortly after that, the San Francisco head of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, one of the major national Muslim groups, gave a speech supporting the recommendations of the report and counseling against working with groups like ours. So this is not an isolated issue. It is an issue that keeps popping up. And exactly as you just heard, this has now come up in very hurtful ways. The University of Vermont, I'd worked with them over a year and a half. There were Take Back the Night kind of events where young women who had experienced trauma already, who wanted to participate in community against sexual assault trauma, were told on social media that they could not be part of those gatherings. Climate movements, whether Sunrise or another one out in San Francisco, were telling very progressive Jewish organizations that they could not be part of them because they were Zionist. This is so the trend that I'm concerned about, that we really focus on, is that this is more than an isolated event. That this is creating an environment that normalizes othering the Jewish people, Jewish people who are pro-Israel. And the more that we are othered and silenced, the more that this creates an atmosphere in which actual physical assaults can also occur. And I think the Boston Mapping Project, in a way, has two lessons for us. For those who subscribe to this kind of ideology, it provides a guidepost for how far you can go. So after this project was vilified, by media, by politicians of all stripes, the national BDS movement had also distanced themselves from it. But I worry that is not about never doing something like that again, but that is about finding what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. That is also very dangerous. And for those who have seen issues like the Sunrise Movement, for example, saying, if you're pro-Israel, you can't be part of us, or we're going to never take a climate trip to Israel again, and said that's just free speech, which of course we all support free speech. To see how far it can go, I think, was also an important wake-up call that the sort of boiling the frog situation of drab of anti-Semitism is incredibly dangerous, because this is where we end up.
Okay, so what I want to do first, just because we're not that big a group here in the room, if anybody has questions, just interrupt and throw it out. We're not going to go with all the formality of QR codes and things like that. I'm gonna come back to the community response and ask you about that in a moment. But Alana's started us on this road of the larger context of what's going on with anti-Semitism. And I don't know if the two of you want to comment on that at all, to add to what Alana already has said, what's going on around the country.
Well, let me take that back down to what happened in Boston, because I do think that goes to the community response and the sort of the next stage of what happened, because I'm sure as you're listening to this, you think, oh, this is about anti-Israelism, this panel, or like this event was about anti-Israelism. And there's a piece of that, but this jumps way, way beyond that almost instantaneously. But part of the community response had to be education and having those conversations right away. Because for some people who saw this site and saw who was promoting it in Boston in those first days, and it was being promoted, I should say, this site is anonymous. We do not know, even today, many months later, who created this site. The FBI has an ongoing active investigation. They got involved, and that's something they've said, they announced publicly in the days after. ADL is doing work on it, which ADL can speak to. But even though it's anonymous, people were like, it was being amplified by other voices within the far left in Boston, voices including those who, and Peggy made reference to this, during the mayoral campaign last year, had, and I want to use the words specifically, not just the descriptive of it, because I think it's important, posted long Twitter threads about the, quote, insidious Zionists who were supporting Michelle Wu. That they were going after, and when I say insidious Zionists, I'm talking about longtime Democratic Party operatives, activists, donors, non-donors, just like campaign professionals who were connected to her. What they were trying to do was to make active members of the Boston Jewish community who are concerned about the big issues of Boston. Israel was not an issue in the mayoral race for Boston. Housing was, transportation was. They wanted to make it toxic for some of these people who are very involved in those issues from participating in her campaign, and they wanted to put her on the spot to distance herself from her own supporters. The same thing was happening here. It wasn't, you go to some of the, and I should stop saying go to because we don't really want to send a lot of traffic to the site, but if one was to trust the interns and the research that was done by ADL and JCRC and others who have combed through this site, and were to see how it talks about, say, a program at Harvard University, you see it clearly leads off with Israel, but then it jumps to all these other things. I referenced some of this in the open. There are all these other evils, all the other evils of society. It says that they're all connected. But then when it ties back to who's responsible for it, who is accountable for that behavior by these institutions, it's only the Jews. So if you go to an Institute for Politics at Harvard University on this, or if you go to the Institute for Contemporary Arts on it, they don't list their entire board. They don't list all of their donors. They just list the Jewish philanthropists in Boston, who are a piece of, but not the totality of those institutions. They are clearly making it about, if only, and what happened in those first days is that these institutions are like, suddenly they're on the defensive. They're getting calls, should they be increasing security? And like, why is this on them? It's not because of who they are. It's not because of what they do. It's because they have a couple of Jewish families in Boston who support them. They're making the Jewish support for those institutions toxic for those institutions. And that's the issue. But because it started with the Israel piece, and because there is connected to a larger thing that's going on with anti-Israelism on the left and the targeting of the Jewish community, what we quickly saw in those first day or so was, frankly, public leaders in Boston were like, oh, it's just criticism of Israel. It's just another model of criticism of Israel. And that was like an instinctive first response. I don't have to their credit, it took a conversation, but it didn't take a long conversation. So that on the very first day after this became public, prominent progressives were denouncing it. And by prominent progressives, I mean people like Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley in Boston, people like Amy Spitalnik at Integrity for America, Rabbi Jill Jacobs at TRUO, which is an anti-occupation Jewish organization. And part of it was like, they were seeing this for the larger scope of what it is. And also they were seeing, frankly, there were Jewish organizations targeted that are anti-occupation organizations, like J Street, which regularly supports and funds and assists, Palestinian groups in the West Bank that are protesting against the state of Israel, or New Israel Fund, which its primary funding model is to support human rights groups within the Palestinian sector, amongst others. So it was clear this was not are you pro-Israel? It's like, are you pro the existence of Israel? And they made it explicit on their website that their indictment of New Israel Fund or Senator Elizabeth Warren was that they are normalizing the existence of the state of Israel. So it's much deeper than what are my politics about the occupation. We had to have those conversations with elected officials. And the first day or two, I would say the first 48 hours, that was a big chunk of the local community response, was just like, no, don't just look at like, oh, who's promoting it, a left-wing anti-Israel Twitter feed in Boston. Look at what it's actually saying. And those people, like the Congresswoman, like both our senators, like wall-to-wall, basically every public leader in Massachusetts quickly saw, once they had that education conversation and did the research for themselves, like, oh no, this is bigger than just a critique of Israel.
Yeah, but we had to really put a fine point on it pretty quickly. So 30 of the 38 NGOs listed on the original version of this were Jewish organizations, including, as Jeremy noted, a group that helps children with disabilities, a Jewish pluralistic high school, a Jewish arts collaborative. So once those data points were kind of decoded for them, it was like an aha moment. But I think it was sort of surprising to many of us that those conversations needed to take place in that way. The initial sort of fear piece went away pretty quickly because we could be very reassuring, and law enforcement in our community was also just right on it, hand in glove with us.
So I'll respond to this question, but I want to say something else first for a minute. We've been talking about anti-Semitism in Israel in that conversation, and there are many layers. I want to remind ourselves that when COVID began, there was a very similar issue for the Asian American community, not just for Chinese Americans. And I think sometimes for us working in the community, it's helpful to step away and see the reflection of these kinds of this kind of hate in a different community, because I think we could see it a little bit more objectively. But it was really the same issue. It's the blame game, and it's connecting people to a country of origin or a country of history in a way that really ends up with physical violence, certainly discrimination, and huge othering. So the kinds of issues we're talking about here are not solely in our community, but so often people say it's a canary in the coal mine for so many other communities. And now to the what. Education and engagement are really so key. And so Jeremy talked a little bit about engagement at the local level. I'll just take it up to the national level for a minute. We have worked with other communities, again, and with ADL, particularly the Asian American community and some others, to pass the Jabara Hire No Hate Act. And now we're working to pass some funding for the Justice Department to be able to implement it. But what that's really about is building the infrastructure, or the beginnings of an infrastructure, for law enforcement to really understand from the communities themselves what's really going on. It's one thing to treat things as a crime. It's another to treat things as a hate crime. And it's one thing for one police department to know of something that's going on in their backyard. It's another to connect the dots and see that kind of mapping across the country to try to understand what's happening with hate. And that's not the only sort of infrastructure that's being built legally, but that's super important for all of us to both work to pass those kinds of initiatives, but also to then support the carrying out of those kinds of initiatives, because laws on the books are not going to do anything unless communities are really working and finding points of contact in law enforcement. The other is an engagement on a political level. We're in a midterm election year. We've got an enormous amount of people who are retiring. We've got enormous changes this year. And it's, as new members are coming in, it's really important that this work of engagement and education is continuously happening, and that relationships are being built so that people have a trusted source in the community to just call up sometimes. That's what a member needs to do, just to be able to call up and say, is this what I think it was? Is, what's going on? What does the community need? What is the fear that's being evoked right now? What's the othering? At Jewish Federations, we work on that in two ways. The community relations councils, like Jeremy runs, are a huge infrastructure to be able to really support that kind of communal relationship, both with other communities, but also elected officials. And the volunteers in our communities who are very active with us, and this is true for other communities as well, the kinds of relationships that they're able to build, this is something we're building called the Advocacy Corps, but the kind of relationships they're able to build, to have that trust with elected officials is very important, because those officials can hold a variety of administrations to carry out their jobs, pass new legislation. They have the bully pulpit to really cry out when this kind of stuff happens. And I think in Boston, the fact that Congresswoman Presley or Senator Warren had said something about it, I think that was helpful to you all, and that's always helpful in other places.
So you've talked a lot about the elected officials and law enforcement response. What about other faith-based communities?
You can take.
Yeah, we didn't prepare this one in advance, so.
There was not a lot of public denunciation from faith communities in this case. And I want to say this, pull us out a little bit. In Massachusetts, we are proud of the fact of the depth of partnership and support that we see across faith communities in times of crisis and times of hate. The times that, after Christchurch, I, along with the mayor and the police commissioner, were invited to speak that Friday at Juma service at the largest mosque in Boston. And basically the entire Jewish and Christian leadership of Boston showed up at the mosque. After what happened here in Pittsburgh, it was wall to wall. The head of every Christian denomination was falling all over themselves to make sure they showed up at our public gatherings. We say as a matter of pride, that in January of 2020, when we were seeing a lot of targeting, particularly in the greater New York area, of violence against Jews, and there was that big march in New York, in Massachusetts, totally of their own volition, Christian leaders who were in partnership with the Jewish community self-organized a letter of solidarity with the Jewish community that was signed by 1,000 Christian ministers across Massachusetts of every background and denomination. That didn't happen in any other state. We're the only place in the country where, outside of the New York area, the reaction was the Christian community had to come together as a Christian community to stand with the Jewish community. So we don't really feel that we experience locally an abandonment of one community for another in these moments in recent years. In this particular case, we actually didn't reach out and ask for that. We were, and there was a reason that we were somewhat giving a message of, there's a political conversation here around the mapping project. This isn't an interfaith rallying conversation. And the political context was that and there was a bit of a back and forth around the mapping about whether we should even respond publicly to it. And I think that's always a question around when marginal fringe hate groups pop up, do you engage them, and does your engagement amplify what they're doing? Now, by the time ADL and JCRC and others locally decided the answer was yes for us, there were a number of factors. One factor was, frankly, that other people were already denouncing it publicly, including Israel's foreign ministry. So it sort of it entered the public discourse before our holiday had ended. In Israel, the holiday ends one day earlier, so they had 24 hours of lead time. And also that members of our community were reaching out in fear was a factor, that our community needed to hear from us, that we were aware of it and on it. But a third factor, and this answers the faith question in a roundabout way, is what legitimized our public reaction was in part because there were legitimate political actors in Massachusetts amplifying it. Not faith leaders. I had not to this day seen a single faith figure of any sort in Massachusetts amplify the project. What we did see were one or two local organizations that are actively part of progressive political mainstream coalitions that were amplifying it on their social media and saying, yay, here's another great contribution to taking apart the insidious Zionist network in Massachusetts kind of stuff. And they were reposting this on their social media. And it was when you see, and there were some conversations that first day where we would reach out to some of the people connected and say, you're in a coalition with this organization and you meet with candidates for state legislature, or candidly, Congresswoman Presley, I don't want to speak to her thought process, but I'm sure she was aware of the fact that one of the groups promoting it was a group who had endorsed her congressional campaign. And so there was a political context for political actors to engage it publicly that was important in those first days. And that was sort of a factor for us of like, we're talking to political actors, not to faith actors in these first days. The other factor of that is like, and I think many communities of vulnerability in those early days of vulnerability, it's like, are we being held by our friends and partners and allies? You know, one of the messages that came, and this is ADL's work, the FBI and others, was like, there was not a new security risk here. In other words, if your institution has already done hardening practices, there are not additional hardening practices you need to do. So that sense of vulnerability was not fed or offset by faith leaders standing with us in that moment of those first days. And it was much more about the law enforcement and political.
Good, thank you. So the response you had collectively, locally, we'll zoom out a little bit nationally as well, the response you had was only due to work you did before. So tell me what you did before to position the Boston community to respond to this in the way you did.
Well, you know, Jeremy noted that this dropped right before Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, and the holiday of Shavuot. A year before, we had sort of the same experience when the city of Cambridge had a pro-BDS resolution, which also dropped with no notice right before Shavuot. And because we have a very collaborative community in Boston where and a lot of trust, both within the organized Jewish community and with, I'll call them our partners, whether it's law enforcement if we need to bring the FBI in, with our U.S. Attorney, Rachel Rollins, who was, one of the first calls made to us when the mapping project dropped to let us know that we had sort of her office's full support for looking into this. Those are all relationships that are established over time that we work very hard at, and that we come not trying to say like, this is ADL space, this is JCRC space. We kind of know that collectively we're much stronger together than we are in separate silos. So that's my 2 cents on that piece, but I see it played out in big picture, big items like these high profile things, but really in everyday work that we do and try to be supportive of each other's work in this space.
And if I can expand a little bit, I think this was an important part of those conversations we were having with public leaders in those first 48 hours, was that we have done a lot of work in the years prior across a variety of communities to establish a norm that we are trusted to define our own experiences of our vulnerabilities. We are trusted to define for our own experiences of what is a hatred targeting our community, and our allies and partners in other communities in Massachusetts will turn to each other to say, what are you experiencing here? And that comes through a lot of different kinds of collaboration and partnership that happens. It comes through the kind of work we've done together, standing up on all kinds of hate and bigotry in Massachusetts. It comes, and I don't just mean myself, I also mean ADL, I mean lots of other organizations, Jewish community, and in other communities. It comes through a strong interfaith organization in Greater Boston that holds that table that has allowed us to come together after events like Charlottesville or Pittsburgh or Colleyville. But part of that dynamic was like in those conversations the day after, it was, no, we're experiencing this as anti-Semitism, and there's a receptivity on the parts of the people we're talking to. It's like, well, if you're experiencing it as anti-Semitism, I need to understand how you experience it as anti-Semitism. And that comes through a reciprocity of having other conversations for years beforehand and relationships where we're experiencing racism. How are you experiencing this racism? We're experiencing anti-trans bigotry in Boston. How are you experiencing anti-trans bigotry in Boston? And by the way, some of the same actors on these various issues. So it's a lot of the deep trust and relationship that allows people to say, only, and in this particular case, only the Jewish community gets to define what is anti-Semitism. And so when this group, the group that went after our mayoral candidate 6 months earlier, and then was amplifying this, was saying like, well, they literally said on social media, the Jewish community doesn't get to police anti-Semitism in Boston. And we're like, pretty sure that the Jewish community gets to define what we experience as anti-Semitism. A lot of the other actors in our civic space were like, well, yeah, only the Jewish community gets to define how we experience anti-Semitism.
Great.
Can I say something about that
Please.
point? Because that's so important, and something we've seen certainly on the national level. And I think that kind of education of other groups and stakeholders is super important. It's also imperative that we do the work to make our own community comfortable standing up and saying that. And I think that we aren't always there, but unless we say it, our allies or our other stakeholders won't even listen to it. And we've been talking about particular incidents, but as we've said, this is an entire environment. This was just the most egregious of the incidents. But some of the things we've worked on are, well, how does anti-Semitism show up in the corporate world, for example? When there's that kind of environment that's building within a corporation, are employees feeling empowered to raise that the way that maybe other isms or other hates would be raised? And doing all of that work ultimately supports being able to stand up and say, no, we get to say and know when we see anti-Semitism, and to be authentic and powerful in saying that to stakeholders and allies, because we've done that work in other contexts in even more sort of low-level concerns.
So, I think I know the answer you'll give. Do you think anti-Semitism is just more normalized than other isms, as we said?
We're both looking at ADL because you do the research.
It's certainly feeling that way. And when I look at a couple things that have happened in Boston just over the last 4 months that kind of make me say that I have at least anecdotal data to say that, it's not just the mapping project. It's that at Tufts University, there was actually a petition to ask other student groups on campus to basically sign up to say, we're not going to have anything to do with any Zionist group. And that was extended to any group that had any connection to Israel, whether it was the program that fostered dialogue on Middle East issues, whether it was J Street or whatever. So, that to me is yet another flavor of this isolation. And that's, a really troubling pattern. And to see it at an educational institution where, our lofty hopes for that are that people are going to learn how to engage in dialogue. And instead, there's a student movement that is just telling people, like, if you have a dialogue, if you have a conversation, then you're quote unquote complicit. So there's that. There's the threat of greater extremism activity right in Boston over the 4th of July, both Patriot Front and a more localized New England group called NSC 131, the National Social Club. We're both in Boston, in masks, of course. 9/11, NSC 131 they hung banners off of freeway overpasses. Jews did 9/11. That sort of out there in your face. What are they asking for? Why is this suddenly an environment where people feel comfortable in what's perceived as a very liberal city to do that? Now, the counterbalance to some of that, and I've been pleased to see, to your point about, is this actually getting normalized? The activity, there's obviously an uptick in activity and much more out there. And even though people are behind masks, which, just like the mapping project, if you believe in what you're saying so strongly, at least tell us who you are. But that's not happening. But this is going on. But there has been now a counter movement to it. And we're seeing sometimes now when NSC 131 turns up in front of Children's Hospital to protest their absolutely essential health care given to trans kids. This past weekend, there were over 100 people in response. And we are seeing, again, anecdotally, I don't have the data on this one because it's so new, that in many of these smaller communities throughout New England where there's a counter rally, that NSC 131 isn't coming back there. So I think that when there's a response, any kind of response like that, whether it's on the extremism front, purely extremism front, or the pure anti-Semitism front, or where those two circles connect, which they do in many, many ways, that's the antidote to the normalization that you were talking about. So end of the day, I think it's gotten more prevalent, but I think that the responses are also coming out there, and that gives me some hope.
Can I? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeremy. I was just going to say, in some ways, it's a great question, but in some ways, I would like to ask a different question, which is, it's all connected, and we certainly, and any one, again, ism or hate is certainly a canary for any other, and I don't. It's the last Olympics that I'd like to participate in, is which one of us has it worse, because and that kind of. The kind of work that I've seen since around May 2021, where there are, at least nationally, groups coming together because you had the anti-hate Asian stuff, you had anti-African American, you had anti-Jewish, all happening at the same time. I'm encouraged by that, although it's still too sporadic and not localized everywhere. Because Boston's a great example, Pittsburgh is a great example. But, and we haven't even talked about the internet, but clearly the ability to bully and hate online without real attribution has exponentially reshaped our environment. And it's a super difficult issue to deal with. I mean, there were congressional hearings just last week, and nobody came up with answers. But I think all of these things are becoming worse because of the platform the internet provides.
Jeremy?
I'm very glad that Alana went first, because I want to build on what you just said in my answer. I certainly don't want to do anything that implies trying to win some Olympics amongst communities. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I believe in the interconnectedness of fear, hatred, othering, that feed off of each other in the dynamics that all of our communities are experiencing. I also, in my own experience, and I think as we've seen as these things play out in the public space, there is not different from other kinds of hatred and bigotry, but there is a particular dynamic within the experience of anti-Semitism that I want to name. And it's how anti-Semitism is responded to when it comes from the right and from the left, even when some of the roots of that anti-Semitism are actually connected. And I'll come back to the mapping project. So while it's fundamentally different, a blind internet website from, say, specifically what happened here at Tree of Life, where 11 people were killed, the underlying thesis of the actors in the mapping project and here in Pittsburgh is actually the same ideology. And the ideology being, the Jews are responsible for whatever I'm feeling oppressed about. Here it's, the Jews are responsible for replacement theology. In Boston, it's, the Jews are responsible for all the ills in Boston as part of their malicious influence on our institutions. So it is the same underlying conspiracy theory, and for a variety of reasons, which I fully agree with, one gets boxed as a kind of far right kind of hatred, and one gets boxed as a far left kind of hatred. I think those of us who are united in our desire to stand up to all kinds of racism and bigotry sometimes have an easier time naming, shaming, defining, and uniting when it is coming from a white supremacist. We see it, reference was made to this neo-Nazi social club in Boston. There is an ease we have, even locally in Boston, in coming together against a group like that clearly sits on the far right. Whereas with the mapping project, as said, there had to be an educational step. And there are one or two organizations that are legitimate political actors in progressive space in Boston who have amplified it and not apologized for it, and have not been directly called out by their partners in Boston for their role in amplifying it, and are still sitting at those tables. And I just think there's something important that needs unpacking about, in some spaces on the progressive left, that anti-Semitism, and when Jews say we experience something as anti-Semitic, it gets handled in a slightly different way from which those same tables handle other kinds of isms. And I'm just going to throw in a plug for a great book on this topic. David Baddiel, who's a British thinker, comedian, writer, author, wrote a book that was published now about a year and a half ago called Jews Don't Count. And okay, I see some familiarity. To understand, David is, by his own, in his own terminology, he is an atheist, socialist, non-Zionist, Labor Party affiliated Jew. And he wrote this book because of what he was experiencing trying to talk about anti-Semitism as he was experiencing it during the Corbyn period. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an important book to read, to raise some questions. It's a short book, it takes you 2 hours, it's very short, it's almost a monograph. To raise some questions about what is the conversation in progressive space where Jews have to do a little more work articulating our experience of anti-Semitism than we have to do when it's about on the right, even if the underlying theology, the underlying conspiracy theories are actually the same.
That was great. So I'm watching the time. Good. We have a question. I have questions too, but I'm going to let you two go. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, sure. I just wanted to, I'm from Boston, born and raised, lived in Rockland, Dorchester my entire life. I'm a Beko grad, so to hear Boston anywhere, I'm like, ooh, I get really excited. I want to know and learn more. I have very close friends of mine who are part of the Jewish Teen Foundation of Greater Boston. I've been to some of their events in Newman Center. My connection to the community at large that's where my heart is. I got off the Green Line right when the Patriot Front was coming through the Freedom Trail. I remember the Friday that the mapping project was dropped, and my dad came home like in a rage I'd never seen before. And like that level of hate, there's no way you talk about like that Olympics of what's worse or who's gone through it more. And that's almost like the worst question to hear, because it's like none of it is ever good. But I say all that to propose my question and say I come from the background of understanding what you've always talked about, but want to learn more on the level of community education for the adjacent groups who may not know what they can do. How important is it at a grassroots level to actually bring that education up to a higher scope? As I feel on the Boston level, from a youth level, I was also on the Mayor's Youth Council. There wasn't enough known about what anti-Semitism actually is and how it's like founded like generationally. It's more than just saying, oh, the Holocaust didn't happen, or the Jews are at the root of all evil. Like there are real levels to this. So I kind of want to know your expertise level on how important it is to actually go to educate.
I imagine all four of us would say it's hugely important. And it's important, I think, in the way Alana was talking about, to see anti-Semitism as another system of oppression, and to have anti-Semitism be one of the many things that are talked about as we talk about racism, as we talk about, anti-gay animus, everything like that. That's all part of the table. I think in what I tend to see, anti-Semitism is sometimes like over there, and maybe that's a problem of our own making, but as those conversations continue, I think that being able to sort of integrate that into the conversation is going to be a really important thing. I think you really touched on something hugely important.
Thanks. I'm just watching the time. Stick around and talk to them afterwards. We had another question. We have about 2 minutes, so that's why I'm going to turn it over.
As you touched upon, there were families whose addresses were on the map. There were educational centers, etc., that kids and people and families. How concretely did you as a community come together to assist getting on the ground with the people who were directly put on the map?
So within, do you want me to take this one?
I mean, I know the answer and the work you guys did on it, so.
Well, we obviously looked at it pretty quickly, and we were able to convene first a smaller meeting that was a more interactive one, really with open to the leaders whose names and addresses were revealed. And we were able to both take questions, offer reassurance, offer assistance, not just from JCRC, ADL, CJP, but also community security experts, the FBI, and other members of law enforcement who could really reassure the community. So that was a really important thing to do quickly. And I think that reassurance came pretty quickly to them. And then I think maybe 2 nights later, we had a big community gathering online, over 1,000 people, like with 24 hours notice. And so again, we were able to communicate what was going on to the community, let them know where they could go for additional assistance in terms of community security, if they were concerned about their building, about their space, if they, so being able to communicate quickly and clearly and transparently, and having, I think, as Jeremy noted, the key players in the community who could provide that reassurance from the outside, members of law enforcement in particular, was really important to the community. And on top of that, adding the voices of many legislators to legitimize what people were feeling and helping to amplify it. And the last thing I'm going to say that we did, which gave everybody a chance to sort of put their name on something by their own choice, was we started an online site called, I think it's Stop Anti-Semitism in Massachusetts or something like that. I should know it exactly. But having a public space for people to say, I'm signing up to this. We actually didn't put individual names, but many institutions and many elected officials. There, it's a statement. Like, if your name's not there, what is that saying? So that whole combination of taking the moment and reassuring people and communicating was, I think, important to our community's feelings of well-being.
So I think our time is actually up. I see the next speakers coming in for the next session. I want to thank Alana, Peggy, and Jeremy. Incredible expertise. Thank you for sharing that with everyone here, and wish everyone a good rest of the day.